Hello and welcome to our media literacy webinar, Fact or Fiction, Making Sense of the Mass Media and the Information We Consume. My name is Aaliyah Darcy, and I wear many hats. Among them, I'm a journalist based in Vancouver and the editor of the Smiley Canada. Today, we're going to talk about misinformation and practical tools that you can use to separate false information from facts. You might have fallen for a piece of fake news before, and that might be why you're here today. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. 90% of Canadians have believed a piece of fake news, and that's why we're here today to talk about what you can do about it. So we're really lucky to have two amazing guests to walk us through this topic. We have Zain Velji joining us from Calgary. He is a partner and VP strategy for Northweather. You might recognize him from CBC, where he is a political commentator, from CTV, where he co-hosted federal election coverage, or from our very own Friday Night Reflections. Zain has served as a campaign manager for Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi. He has worked on Elizabeth Warren and Barack Obama's campaigns, and he has hosted an award-winning podcast on politics. So I'm pretty excited to hear the tips he has for us today about how to navigate political misinformation. We also have Dr. Sima Yasmine joining us from California, where she is the director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative. I'm especially excited to welcome Sima because we studied journalism together, and I'm a huge fan of her work. She is an Emmy award-winning journalist, a medical doctor trained at Cambridge, a former CDC disease detective, and an author of various books. Her latest book is called Viral BS: Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them. Over the last year, you might have seen Sima on CNN or elsewhere in the media. She's been spending a lot of her time debunking fake news related to the pandemic. Okay, so let's get into it. Sima, as I just mentioned, over the past year, you've spent a lot of time covering misinformation related to COVID-19. Can you talk about the ways in which you've seen misinformation spread?
Yes, and hi, Alia. Thank you so much for having me. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We are very much confronting a pandemic of a virus, but also a misinfodemic, which is an epidemic of false information, and the two are spreading in tandem. It's something that I've actually been studying since 2015, after I'd left the CDC's Epidemic Intelligence Service, where I was an officer, and had then gone to journalism school with you, Alia, and then became a health and science reporter. And just to give you a bit of background as to even why I made that trajectory, why I started studying this in this field, is because when I was a disease detective in the Epidemic Intelligence Service, every time I got deployed to a different hot zone, a different place where a disease was spreading, I realized that there wasn't just an epidemic of disease I was up against, but there were also medical myths and health hoaxes and all kinds of rumors that were spreading alongside the pathogen, really fueling transmission and sometimes making it very difficult for me to do my job. So I explain that to say that this phenomenon of false information about health and science, especially spreading alongside a pathogen, is not a new phenomenon. It's been around forever. And it's been an uphill struggle for me actually in the last few years trying to get buy-in from large public health agencies who are kind of like, yeah, we don't think that this problem of misinformation and disinformation is actually a real threat to public health. COVID-19 comes along, and I think everyone is aware that, oh, it's not just the virus that spreads. What you also have is contagious information. Actually, the same mathematical models I used to use to study where a disease might spread, who it might infect, you can use the same mathematical models to look at where information might spread, how a tweet might go viral, how a Pinterest post that is anti-vaccine may go viral and actually kind of infect many, many people with some rhetoric, and sometimes that can be quite harmful. So that's what we've been seeing over the last just over a year. We've seen also the very real impacts, negative impacts of false information that people have fallen vulnerable to. I'm really glad to hear you say, Alia, in the introduction, that anyone that's fallen for any falsehood should not in any way be ashamed. Within the field that I work in, when I talk to other disinformation scholars, we like to say, what's something that you've fallen for, that you believe that you then found out was not real, was not true? Because it's important to remember that we are all vulnerable, we are all susceptible to believing things that are inaccurate and misleading. We can get more into why that is, but it's humbling to remember that. It's really good to not be prideful and think because I am very educated or for whatever reason, I would never fall prey. There is just so much information out there. And with COVID, we've seen people resort to terrible bleach. There was an increase in the number of people registering at poison control centers after President Trump talked about bleach. We've seen people fall prey to misinformation and disinformation about particular treatments and preventative measures for COVID-19, none of which worked. So I think it's really brought to light the public health impact of false information.
Thank you, Sima. It's really fascinating to hear about how you've seen this issue develop over time, not just with the current pandemic, but with previous epidemics as well. So how would you say misinformation affects the outcome of this pandemic, or how have you seen it affect the outcome in some of the previous disease spreads that you've studied?
So we saw this same phenomenon occur during the Ebola epidemic of 2014 to 2016, which started in West Africa. We saw it during the Zika epidemic as well. And what you see is you see people fall prey to false information that puts them in harm's way. And also, I will say, I think it's really important to be on the same page in terms of the words that we use and the power of words that we use to describe this phenomenon. So in my field, we don't use the term fake news unless we are specifically referring to the way that that term has been weaponized against journalists, has been weaponized against journalism as well. And also because fake news is just so vague and broad. So we have specific definitions to talk about, very precise issues. We talk about misinformation being the spread of false information where it is false, but there isn't malicious intent behind it. So misinformation we saw during Ebola, for example, was spreading, saying things like, if you eat coffee grounds, you won't get Ebola. Or we saw during COVID-19, there was misinformation, again, false information spread without the intent to cause harm that could be your neighbor saying, hey, I heard if you eat loads of garlic, you won't get COVID. Now, that's not true, but then probably your neighbor isn't trying to hurt you. On the other hand, you have disinformation, which is false information that is spread with the intention of causing chaos and harm. It can be to chip away at democracies. It can be what we saw during Ebola when there was a Russian-backed disinformation campaign spreading false information, spreading disinformation that there was an Ebola outbreak in Atlanta, for example, when there wasn't. And that kind of thing can cause panic, can divert emergency resources away from where they're needed. And we've seen similar things happen during COVID. Certainly, I think all of us have been inundated with misinformation, that false information that's often spread by family and friends, but on social media too, where people are trying to give you friendly tips that have no basis in truth. And sadly, we've also seen disinformation, sometimes state-backed, we think, from other nations, trying to sow distrust in the medical evidence and in the scientific establishment. A lot of that, of course, now in early 2021 is specifically anti-vaccine or sowing distrust around vaccine and mass vaccination programs. So those are just some of the examples, but there are many, many more.
That's such an important distinction you've made just now, Sima, between the different types of false information. And with misinformation that people are spreading, for example, information about how to cure COVID that's false, they may be spreading it with good intentions, but it can lead to somebody doing something that they think is helping them that's not. And this is why the topic of this webinar is so important, that this isn't just about bad intentions, but making sure, what you're sharing with your family and friends is true, so it doesn't affect them in a negative way. So, Sima, you've given us a great overview of what's happening around the world. I'd like to turn to Zain now. Zain, can you tell us a little bit about how you've seen social media affecting understanding of facts in Canada?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. And first of all, let me thank the organizers. Thank you, Alia, for moderating this, and great to be on a panel with Sima and her expertise in this matter, demonstrated by that unbelievably comprehensive answer as to the nature of how we've seen these things. What I'd add to the mix is that I absolutely 1,000% agree that this concept of misinformation and disinformation, I love the distinctions that we've been able to make thus far, are not new. But what is new, or relatively new, is this catalyzing engine known as social media. What started out in 2007 and 2008 as this precious way to connect with long lost friends from university, or aimless, joy in some ways to connect with strangers, or sharing pictures of grandkids, has taken on a very different turn in the last couple of years. And I think that turn is one related to algorithmic communications. We can get into that, which is effectively the profit engine for some of these social media platforms, which means they will promote what resonates with audiences. And what we know, and I'm sure Sima can verify this through her extensive research, is that content that divides, content that is either inciting a sense of fear or a sense of emotionality on 11 on the volume scale, is what moves on these platforms. And these companies have realized that the best way to make profit and keep eyeballs on their platforms is by promoting and displaying content that does just that. Which means that what was once a platform to share pics of your grandkids and connect with friends has now, in a 2021 world, turned into being a platform that, if you are not paying for it, which, let's be clear, none of us are, we are all the product. And if we are the product, we have to understand that there is someone else's agenda being put in front of our agenda to receive quality information, to receive quality content that's vetted and that's understood. I can get into the complications of Facebook and its democratic injustices I feel like it has caused across the world. I won't. I'll save that. But I think that's what's kind of been the net new factor here, right? Is this catalyzing force that has now got its own agenda that is not aligned to the agenda of delivering truthful information to the public. Facebook, and more particularly Facebook and Twitter, the couple, are now one of the largest ways to distribute information, more specifically news, in the world. And they have an agenda that is fundamentally, as much as they'd like to say, let me be totally clear, fundamentally misaligned with the agenda to singularly receive and get information as a customer or a user of those platforms that is truthful, factful, and well-researched. So that's the problem we find ourselves in. I'll maybe add one more sort of contextualizing variable that kind of talks to Sima's point around history here, because I think it's really important. When we talk about two things. Number one, how we as human beings make decisions. We have to understand that the way we receive information and what we believe, and why the frustration, why this is such a sticky situation, and why many people feel like, well, why can't we just show the facts to someone and it's over, right? Like, why can't I, right? This has happened so many times. Someone has made up their mind on a particular subject matter. Why can't you just show them the facts and they'll change their mind? And there's a fundamental misunderstanding at the core of this, which is how human beings make decisions, which is we don't make decisions in a logical, rational way, in a step-by-step basis that then tracks through, every piece of evidence, calculates it, weighs the pros and cons. No, we make decisions based on emotions, on snap judgments, and then we find and hunt the evidence that scaffolds and supports that snap judgment. And you might think that you're a progressive, elite, well-educated person who doesn't make decisions that way. You're lying to yourself, because that is how we make decisions for the most part. We find a gut snap judgment, and then we scaffold ourselves, whether you're on the right or the left of the political spectrum, whether you're the upper class or the lower class, we scaffold what information we need to satiate and to surround ourselves with the psychological comfort that the information we have is truthful. So there's a big sort of historical component to this. There's a psychological component to this, which is why when misinformation and disinformation enters the zeitgeist, why it is so hard to extract, why it is so hard to cleanse, both from a personal and societal level. So I feel like I've done nothing other than just add to the problem mix. But I think it's really important we understand what's going on here. There's societal, cultural, psychological, technological, and political dimensions to a problem that, let's be totally frank, I hate to sound so pessimistic here, that in a scale will take many years to overcome. But I think there's many things we can do individually to become more vigilant as we try to combat these challenges that are frankly in front of us as to receive information and facts on a daily basis.
And if I may just echo, I think a really important point that you made, that more information is not the antidote to the false information that's spreading, which can sound really despairing, I think, to people. But there's so
Sure.
much evidence that shows that, especially when there's a polarized conversation, when there are two people in disagreement, pouring facts onto that conversation is like pouring kerosene onto a fire. We have documented this through communications research for a really long time. So it frustrates me, especially from the scientific world, when our perspective is, oh, we're going to just go and debunk, absent context, absent understanding of how someone came to form those beliefs in the first place. It doesn't work. And I really like that you reiterated my point about the education, because when I do give these talks to a very esteemed scientist and we're trying to train them into having more nuanced ways about communicating science, I think when I talk about cognitive biases, the ways that we take in and don't take in information, the feeling can be, well, I have a medical degree or I have a PhD, right? Actually, the communication scholars will say to you, the higher your level of educational achievement, the deeper those cognitive biases run. So you can be more likely to dig your heels in. I think it's just really, really important to reiterate those points.
Wow, clearly this is such a complex issue. There's emotions, facts, fiction, all kinds of political forces involved. So, what do you think we can do about it? What can the people who are at home listening to us talk, what can they do about it?
Maybe
Uh,
I'll start first and kind of just repeat a point that I think is super important that I think Ali, you made, and Sima, you made too. And then Sima, I think you may have more to say on this, but I just wanted to reiterate this point. Um, this is not a problem that just our parents, and I feel like we're in the same generational category, I'll clump us together without any offense, just our parents fall for. We have to be totally honest about that. This is not something that just the boomers do. This is not something that your moms and your aunts on WhatsApp are just forwarding and it's their problem. No, you mentioned off the top, 90% of us fall for this. And if you think that's BS, you can take one of those tests. Ali, I've heard one of your previous presentations you've given to the journalism community where you asked people to go through this test. And it was, these are trained, educated people who feel like they've got a good sniff test in how to decipher what's fake and not. And you hit that same number. Like, a lot of people fall for this stuff. So this might sound silly to say, but we have to stop stigmatizing this as an issue that only affects a generation of our parents or those that are, let's just say, not as well educated or maybe not as well. This is not their, this is our problem. Because regardless of A, if it were true, regardless of that fact, it's something that has ripple and domino effects beyond that. But B, it's not true. This is something that affects all of us. We can all fall prey. We already have, many of us in many ways. Maybe not because we don't have the education or the sense of understanding and digesting what it is, but maybe we just didn't read it enough. Maybe we didn't examine it enough. Maybe we didn't have that critical eye, so to speak. So I think that's the main point I want to add here is that, like, you could scoff, you could feel like this is someone else's problem, you could feel like this is a generational thing, that boomers are falling for Facebook ads and WhatsApp forwards. It is not. This is stuff that people that are educated, well-regarded, respected, of all stripes, all strata, all class are ultimately at prey for. So we need to kind of be in it together in that larger domain, I believe.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Zain. I think it's important. That's why I was saying earlier as well, like within my field, we like to ask each other, what's something you've fallen for? Or like, you believed it for a bit too long before you realized, oops, I've been duped. And even when I was writing this book, which is all about medical myths that spread, I thought, I'm a professional debunker, but I should start with a confession. So in the introductory chapter, I talk about how growing up in the UK in a very tight-knit Sunni Muslim immigrant a community of like Gujarati people, I believed all sorts of conspiracy theories because people around me did, and because it really actually made sense to believe things that were absurd. And I kind of explained the context of that. And partly it's about our upbringing and what we were taught about the British Empire and such egregious and unbelievable things that actually happened in real life,
Yes.
really, to our family. So then, hey, there's these other wild and absurd things that we believe that happen to be false, that to us seemed quite feasible. So I don't get despairful, if that's the right word, because I think there's many things that we can do, but I do think, and maybe this is just with my physician hat on, that really making a good diagnosis and really understanding the problem, having the right language, for example, to describe the different nuances can go a long way. Then, however, I want to add another problem into the mix. This is something I deal with all the time as a journalist, but especially as a journalist who cut her teeth at a local newspaper. I'm very passionate about local news and very in deep in with the data that shows when a community loses its local newspaper, it has a really bad impact on governance. Taxes go up, corruption increases. There's very real impacts. However, a mantra that we local journalists love to say is support local news, subscribe to your paper, believe what you see in the news. And that ain't simple either. So, for example, my family in our WhatsApp group will sadly share lots of false information and conspiracy theories. And I sometimes get really annoyed, but it is what it is. This stuff is circulating. It's not as easy for me to say to my very devout Muslim family, here's a link to the New York Times. Please believe what they say about vaccines, because there's 15 years or more actually worth of studies looking at New York Times coverage of Muslims. It's grossly inaccurate. Our communities are misrepresented all the time. Therefore, should we trust them? What kind of relationships do we have with so-called credible news outlet? So that gets murky. And then from the medical side, we have a medical establishment and a scientific field that built up knowledge of the exploitation of vulnerable people. We literally did experiments on marginalized people with learning difficulties, Jewish people, Black people, queer people, disabled people. And now we're saying, we don't want to pay attention to that, but you should just trust us now. Roll up your sleeve and get a vaccine now, when we haven't done the work of acknowledging or atoning for our past and really understanding that, hey, there are communities that have legitimate reasons to distrust both the press and to distrust the medical and scientific establishment. So again, not to say, I'm just going to keep throwing problems at you. There are not solutions, but no, it's really important for us to understand where the problems stem from. And only then, I think we can kind of really get into developing interventions and tackling this productively.
Alia, can I step in there just to respond to that, if you don't mind? I know you've got a question, and you're poking us for solutions, and keep doing so, because we'll get to them. But I think there's something really interesting here, because I had this as something I was thinking of prior to, which is, the conventional wisdom, if I can call it that. And Seema, I'd love to kind of see if you believe this too. And I think you kind of mentioned it with the New York Times. The conventional wisdom here is like, if you see something that could be fake, just go to the New York Times, or in Canada here, the Globe and Mail or Torstar, or some reputable organization. And I wish that was as easy as done, because to your point, the biased information that they may have on a subject A, B, or C, you mentioned our collective Muslim community, I think is a great example. But there's also this boon that we're now experiencing in journalism of I wouldn't say organizations devoid of credibility, but new upstart media brands that are employing either journalists or writers or folks that now have to find different outlets because of the state of journalism, which we can get into as an entirely different thing. But they're working at outlets, or they're working for themselves. They're credible, they're trustworthy, they're putting out really good content, but they don't have the masthead of the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the BBC. Where do they lie in the mix? So, the thing here is that when we take misinformation and disinformation as step one, I come from a political background. My focus here is, of course, these things, and not to say I've got a higher order I'm focused on, not at all, but I want engaged citizens. I want democratically engaged people. Misinformation, disinformation is a barrier we have to overcome to become engaged citizens. And so the trouble I have, to add to the mixture of maybe not problems, but context, that's my new word for problems, is that I don't want people consuming the same thing just because it's the safe thing to consume. We want interested, we want interesting, we want textured people. We just want them working from the same fact base. I think that's what we're asking for. We're not saying that, only read and consume institutional things, which I think has traditionally been a lot of the advice over the past, I'd say 16 months, saying double down. If you're looking to get coverage of the American election that just happened, what was the advice given by most people? Go to the Washington Post and New York Times. At least they're sturdy rocks that you can, count the fact that it's at least truthful. What we lost there in many ways, and this is just my observation, is people perhaps not expanding their horizons, people not expanding their worldview, people playing it safe because of this threat of misinformation and disinformation. So additionally contextualizing this, and you may have some comments or solutions to that, is this additional challenge that we face when we want to try to, just as a simple note, get over this barrier to create people that have different opposing worldviews. That's not a bad thing. Dissent is not a bad thing, but working from a different fact base, that's, I think, what we're trying to combat, right?
Yeah, and I will say that, for people in the moment when they're reading something on their Twitter timeline, on their Facebook feed, one of the things that I say as a red flag, and you mentioned this earlier, is when you get that whoa feeling, like, whoa, what did I just read? And you read something that incites emotion, disgust, hatred, like joy, or it just feels really, really new. Those actually are red flags that this could be false information. So I bring this up because at that point, before you hit retweet, before you hit send to all WhatsApp group chats, I tell people to pause. And I was part of this UN campaign last year that was pledged to pause. A good thing you can all just do in that moment, which honors the fact that emotionality is such a big component of this. Just stop for a second, recognize that you just got that, what I call the woe feeling. Recognize that you may have got the woe feeling because you're reading something that's novel, feels very new, and you're reading something that made you feel a strong emotion. And those are things that actually help falsehoods go viral. Now, at that point, when you've paused, despite what I've said about journalism and despite what I've said, and we can go into lack of objectivity and all of this stuff, I still don't think it's a bad first step to go to the New York Times, to go to Toronto Star, to go to the Global Mail, to go to the Washington Post. Just see, is this really new? Are other sources reporting this? So it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I hope the takeaway from this is not to like throw local journalism away, especially. It's no, let's invest in local journalism more. Let's hold local journalism accountable too, because when a town loses its local newspaper, what we also see, as well as taxes going up, corruption going up, is we see an increased polarization in political views, at least with the US data that I've seen. So I want there to be local journalism. I want that to still be one of the first few sources you just go to see, is this thing on Facebook legit? Is anyone else talking about this? Are there other sources that are reporting this too? We just need, when we talk about media literacy, is to be aware of the shortcomings of journalism. And also we just need journalism to do a lot better. So I just want to add that it's not about like discounting, not that you're saying that, Zain, but I just want the takeaway to be still please subscribe to your local paper, but know that there are issues there.
That kind of is a really nice seg into, what we really want to get to in this session, which is what kind of things can people be doing to combat misinformation and make sure they're not spreading it. And so I think the two of you have highlighted some really valuable points around, it's not only the source, it's not only the claim. There's a bunch of different things you have to check. Just because something is from a reputable publication that is known for checking its facts doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. So let's kind of move through some of those different things that people can check for when they get that low feeling or, they have reason to question or verify something. Sima, in your book, Viral BS, at the back, you have a little toolkit to kind of help people navigate the fake news space. So one of the things you talk about in there is how can people check claims? Could you tell me a little bit about some of the tips that you have for that?
Yes, and I'll just reiterate again that pausing, it can be invaluable because it can stop you being part of that problem where you're the one retweeting, you're the one sharing something where you haven't done your due diligence. There are about 10 or 12 steps in that BS detection kit at the back of the book. A couple of them I've already alluded to, like what we've learned, and you may remember actually in 2018, there was a study that came out of MIT. And some of the headlines that were generated by the study said things like, false information travels faster and farther than the truth. Lies go viral more than, and you're just like, wait, what? Like, is there any hope there? It was a great study, but what I found most useful was kind of doing reverse engineering. Like, okay, why would something that's false go more viral than something that's true? And it comes down to exactly what Zain and I've already mentioned, that emotional trigger, but also that novelty factor. And this is a really interesting part of human psychology, is that when you read something and you're like, whoa, I don't think I've come across this before. Hey, what happens is our brain is like, hey, I also don't think anyone in my circle has come across this. And subconsciously, we believe that we'll get hierarchy points or status points by being the person that shares the new thing. Everyone's going to be like, oh, wow, what? Look at Zain. Like, he knew this thing about the vaccine before I did. And what would have happened is Zain was just emotionally triggered by this thing that he saw that wasn't false, and he was terrible, and he didn't pause, and he didn't check a few sources. Sorry, Zain, to put you in this. But so
no,
really, I just don't want to understate the importance of just stopping for a second, remembering, okay, novelty and emotionality, okay, red flag doesn't mean it's completely false, but those are going to alert me to doing a few things. So those few things would be just looking at other sources. We've kind of muddied the waters there, which I think is very important. Hey, journalism is highly imperfect, but there are still sources we can go to just to kind of get a lay of the land. And I'll say, Alia, actually, you make a good point. It's not always just about outright falsehoods. A couple of days ago, I got early in February, I got really frustrated with a New York Times article about the AstraZeneca vaccines not being used in South Africa anymore, because there was just a definitiveness in the reporting about the science when the science was saying we're not quite sure yet. So even that alone, and there's already, because we're studying this so quickly, been studies looking at how far did those articles go and how misleading were they, so that they weren't outright false. It's true, the trials were not the trials, the vaccine use was halted, but the way the science was framed made it just sound like a done deal when actually there's still a lot on the line. So that's another thing as well. So yeah, there's many more steps, but I think those are some of the easiest to remember, I think. Zane, do you want to add some to that?
No, those are great. I also had the gut check one. I think you phrased it so much better, so I won't retread that territory. I think that's a really important one. The novelty aspect is also something, right? Like, I think you made a great point about the hierarchy, the emotionality of wanting to share this. Let's also
Yeah.
remember, right? Social media is a tool. It is not your friend. If I could leave you with one thing, it is that, right? And what they want you to do is the reason that that forward button on WhatsApp is so big and so conveniently placed. They want you to forward content. They want you to be on their platform. There's a reason that the notifications are so addictive to look at. It is reverse engineered with your psychology in mind. It wants you to put that out there. So if I can leave you with a very simple point, that use social media as a tool. I'm not trying to say divorce your life from it, but it is not your friend because it's got its own agenda. And a lot of the things Sima mentioned here, the distribution factor of hierarchy points and friends and family and social proof that I'm the quickest to information or the most with it are largely social media related in terms of distribution when we think of them. So take that pause when consuming that information, but take that double pause when you actually think about what platform you're distributing it on, and understand that those go and found it from. Understand they have their own goals that are largely divorced from yours, which are about getting quality news and journalism. The additional things I will say are perhaps quite simple, but I think very important to reiterate. Number one, is some literacy around understanding, what is journalism, what is opinion, what is analysis, and what is punditry, right? I'm a pundit, which means an analyst. I don't do real news reporting. I acknowledge that, unlike the two of you who are journalists, I take what's happening in the zeitgeist and give my own spin, talk about in the backdrop, but I'm always acknowledging that to be the fact. Same thing when you read something or consume it. Is this a journalist? Is this an expert? Is this someone with their own agenda, political or otherwise? And it's not bad to have people with their own agenda. You just need to be able to recognize it. So look for flags that say analysis, opinion. Most, notable news organizations are very good at ensuring that they do that. That they ensure that what type of piece this is, which then gives you a better fact base to kind of consider. Am I consuming this as straight fact, or is this someone's opinion based on a set of facts as well? And then the last thing I'll say, which is perhaps not a solution to misinformation and disinformation, but probably is the natural extension to some of the things we've been talking about, is pay for it. Pay for good news. Pay for journalism that matters. Local, national, international. May not sound like the easiest or simplest thing when you say, well, it's available on the internet. I mean, that's inherently what we're talking about here, is that everything you find there can't necessarily be trusted. So if you're paying for it, you're able to employ quality people at quality institutions, big or small, institutional or individual, that produce the stories and produce the quality output that matter.
And I want to add one more thing to the social media piece, if that's okay, Alia, because Zane, you mentioned them not being our friends. And I say this as someone who really enjoys social media and gets a lot from it. But it's been well documented that social media platforms employ algorithms that incentivize engagement with information that has all the red flags of being false. And they've known this for a long time. It works really well for the business model. It does not work well for democracies and public health. So I want to tell you about a study that came out last year. In brief, it found that when people people were exposed to anti-vaccine messaging on Twitter, the people that took that message offline into a real world conversation with friends and family, like, hey, I saw this thing, and I'm making this up, but it said, if you get the flu shot, you can get flu, which is completely false. When they took that message off Twitter and into a conversation with trusted family and friends, they were less likely to fall for that information compared to the people who just kept scrolling and who had just engaged with that false information on the social media platforms. So having community who holds us accountable, who says, hey, you sent me this thing and I think that looks kind of dodgy, and having people who are also critical in their analysis of this information can be really, really helpful for our mental health, our well-being, and our resilience to believing falsehoods.
So kind of building on that point, let's say that you see something on Twitter that strikes your interest, or a claim in a blog, or something in a news story that you want to see, like, how true is this? What would you do to check the accuracy of that information? Sima, I'll let you go first, and then maybe Zain, you can add any points that you have.
Yes, I'll just try and summarize kind of what we've gone over before. If I read it, and especially if I got the woe factor, I would pause for a second before I completely consumed and believed that. I hope this is an ideal situation, right? I would kind of take the conversation offline, I hope, and talk to other trusted sources. I'd also do a little bit of my due diligence maybe before having that conversation, certainly before sharing it, where I'm clicking the link. Even that, is often we don't see people do it. It's just the retweet. And now Twitter, of course, says, do you want to read the article? Like, yeah, that's a good idea. Let me at least see what the source is, especially because on social media, it looks like a New York Times article is very similar to an article that comes from a very much not New York Times kind of outlet, right? It could be very, very shady and look just as legitimate, if you like. So looking at a range of sources, being aware of that emotional and status factor, taking the conversation offline, and of course, just taking the time to do that before having what I call social media trigger fingers, where you're like, retweet, retweet, like, save. Just take your time to first do a couple of checks before you share with millions of people, because that's how far, and wide these messages can go.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to share. We have to kind of train ourselves to, or take that step. So one other thing I want to highlight from Sima's toolkit is that it talks about how to check the veracity of an image or a video. Zain, would you be able to give us some tips about how we can check if a video or an image that we're seeing, if it's actually real?
Yeah, and Sima, you may have more specific tips, but some of the things that I've utilized thus far or found helpful start with the same gut instinct. The gut instinct never leaves, right? Like, that's the first step. Does this look fake? And I don't just mean aesthetically. I mean, does this look fake in the sense of context, timing, where I found it, the source? Just like the source of a news article, source of an image in many ways can also be a red flag, or a flag of some sort, as to its truthfulness or veracity. So that gut instinct never leaves you. But you're now more curious. You now think it might have qualifications of being fake. One of the simplest tools that I find to use is the Google reverse image search, which you can kind of take an image, drag and drop it. If you haven't done this before, it's quite simple. You take an image and you go to images.google.com, you drag and drop it there, and you see where else it's been populated on the internet. And often what happens when you populate a fake image, it will reproduce an image that's close or real, that kind of contextualizes where the source of that image comes from. So it gives you a sense of, once again, it's similar, it's not the same. It's similar to saying, is this something that has seen the light of day beyond the time that I'm seeing it? And is it then referenced in sources, websites, journals, articles, etc., that I deem to be legitimate, institutional, with credibility? So those are some of the first sort of simple things that I think folks can do. I'm not sure, Sima, if you've got additional items that might kind of accompany that to go a step or two further, or maybe even add some steps in between.
Oh, I would only add to it that we often drop the ball when it comes to images and video. But bearing in mind what we've said, especially about the woe factor, let's be really cognizant of the fact that images can hit us a lot harder than words. So there are disinformation scholars who study simply, very complicated, but they focus very much on the photos and the videos that go viral. And I think you've summed up really nicely what to be aware of, but just be mindful of that. It's not just the written tweets. And in fact, actually, Pinterest, I don't know if this is surprising to people, it's not to me anymore, but I was initially surprised by it, is such a hotbed for anti-vaccine images and anti-vaccine messages overall. So I almost feel like we drop the ball when it comes to visual stuff, but we should actually almost have like a guard up that's even higher than when it comes to textual information. So I'd like people to just be really aware of that.
Thank you so much, both Zain and Sima. Those are such excellent tips. So we're reaching our time, so I'll just wrap up with one more question. Do you think these challenges we're facing with false information, misinformation, disinformation, are they putting our democracy at risk?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go to Sima and then Zain.
Yeah. No, so I mean, I live in the States and we saw what happened on January 6th, 2021 at the US Capitol. Very predictable, if you ask disinformation scholars or you ask many Black Americans, that was a predictable set of awful, tragic, frightening events. And I think I just raised that, even though I could actually pick up Pizzagate or the rise of QAnon, so many other things, which literally take their steps from the KGB disinformation playbook. Literally, you can map it out one by one. I kind of summarize it into like 6 or 7 steps, but it's an old playbook using new media and new platforms to amplify and accelerate in a way that we have never seen before. So we've always had these dynamics. This is not new, but we now have faster, better, more terrifying ways of spreading that misinformation and disinformation that can and actually aims to chip away at democracy. So yes, my answer is a resounding yes, which is why I'm really, really passionate about this topic. And I also have a lot of hope, because I think otherwise you can just feel despair and just be like, oh, put my hands up, I don't know what to do with this. But no, really, if we educate kids about how to be media literate, how to be critical in their analysis, and we educate ourselves too, not just kids, obviously, but then I think we can go a long, long way in having an informed citizenry, which is central to a democracy, a central piece to it. So I have a lot of hope that through these kinds of sessions and through so many other avenues, we can build resilience around misinformation and disinformation spreading.
Absolutely. There is a lot of reason for hope because people are taking a lot of interest in this. Hopefully all of you listening are going to act on our tips. Zain, what's your take on this question?
I can't say enough how much is at stake. Like, a lot is at stake. We have seen governments swing. Literally, let's go back 4 years. The making of Donald Trump in the United States through the inaction of a socially maladjusted teenager who wanted to rape girls and then had the throttles of democracy by running Facebook. That is on his feet. Like, that is what happened. We are seeing the catalyzation of shareholder value running in head-on into the democratic institutions and the civic literacy of people across the world. And I've been pretty light-handed with social media platforms up until this point, but it is ultimately a huge, huge problem until these social media platforms figure out that they are responsible, that they should be publishers of content, that they need to have responsibility around moderation and what is put on their platform, and not just squarely focus on what makes them dollars and cents. We're going to have this problem linger. Now, all that being said, I think there's a few things we can do. I think we've listed a lot of them around how your personal vigilance and research can help with that, because this might sound to you right now as something that is cosmetic, something that would be nice to not embarrass yourself in front of your friends and family. But let's not forget the most important point I think Sima said. Just because your Twitter followership is 12 or 20 or 50, or just because your social network is small and you feel like, what impact will I have? That's the exact point of this. You know, the one word we haven't really double clicked on here is viral, right? This double entendre, Sima, to your point. The reason this goes viral is not just because of the big players with millions of followers. It goes viral because of all of us. right? And it is us that spread information one to another to another. The contact tracing, which is a word we're incredibly familiar with these days due to the pandemic, but the contact tracing on misinformation that us normal everyday people who feel like, we just live normal everyday lives have on the actual impact as to the veracity and the volume, and then the unbelievable outright action caused by some of these things, referencing January 6th again, is in our control. So I think we need to understand our role here. It's not just about saving face and maybe not earning those social hierarchy points. It's the contributions we make to the quite literal viral nature of some of this spread of misinformation. The one final thing I maybe just will kind of round it out, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, and Sima certainly mentioned, is this term influence, right? And I think we've kind of seen it around, who has influence over you? And the question I'd ask is, who do you have influence over, right? So if you feel like you're listening to this, my suggestion to you, my conversation with you would be to say, don't stigmatize friends and family when they share misinformation in that sense, being like, oh, that's just their problem. I'm going to repeat that point. But B, understand that you can talk to them in some ways, that you have disproportionate influence over your mom, over your dad, over your brother, over your little sibling, more so than most people. And it is only by using the influence that we have around those that trust us the most, by being friends and family of those folks, that can we start breaking this down. And we've seen, to our earlier conversation, it's not onboarding them with more factual based information. It's having a conversations. It's that inquiry around, why did you feel like this was interesting? Or, this is what I found. It's soft shoeing into it, trying to figure out the doubts that they may have, or maybe even have thought of before they shared it themselves, before they actually had those trigger fingers. And it's kind of not exposing them, but bringing them along in that process. Because, I can't state this enough. This is a conversation, especially at scale, that we have seen democratic impacts many times over. We've talked in a North American context. I mean, I could talk to you about the Philippines and the unbelievable work that someone like Maria Reza and Rappler are doing to try to combat fake news information. But that has elected a president. Fake news and misinformation and social media, catalysm has elected a president of the United States. This is not a small problem. This is a problem that has tremendous impacts, but there's a few small actions we can take that certainly can have a disproportionate impact in terms of our curbing some of this stuff. So I'm sorry to get on my soapbox, but I think this is super, super important as it relates to that particular question.
Absolutely.
And it's very much the attitude. Oh, sorry, Ali, I was going to add one more thing, which is I really like what you're saying, Zane, because it's very much the attitude we're saying to people to have regarding COVID-19. It's not that everyone's a super spreader, but it doesn't require super spreaders. It's each of us. We put on our
So
mask.
well said.
I know
Exactly.
Everyone watching this puts on their mask every time they go out, right? Because you're doing your individual part, you're keeping your germs in, protecting others from a virus that you may be carrying and not even be aware of. It's the same attitude with this. Yes, we need to do things on a massive scale, on a governmental level. We need to lobby governments to include media literacy in every single state's curriculum, and that's not the case so far. We need to lobby social media platforms to disincentivize engagement with false information, and then we're part of that puzzle too, and we need to put on our mask against COVID, but also put on our metaphorical mask against spreading misinformation and disinformation. So it's all of those things combined.
It's so interesting to see how there is so many parallels between the pandemic and misinformation, but also how they've influenced one another in terms of trajectory. But I really value this hopeful note that we're ending on, that even though it is this huge challenge, there's something that all of us can do about it. That's why the three of us have come together for this webinar today. I think I can speak for all of us when I say that, we're here because we are hopeful that we can help solve this challenge together. So thank you so much for your time, Zane and Sima. Really appreciate having the opportunity to hear all of your insights and share them with our community. So thank you so much for joining today and coming to this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.